$890 billion. That is how much economic activity depends on the Great Lakes every single year. And this morning, Mark Carney just signed a law that gives him complete control over every drop of that water, effectively destroying America's most critical economic lifeline forever. Not one drop leaves Canada without our explicit permission. No consultation with Washington, no phase, in period, just a complete ban on water exports from the basin that provides drinking water to 40 million Americans and supports nearly $1 trillion in annual economic activity. The Great Lakes contain 21% of the world's surface freshwater, 6 quadrillion gallons, more water than all other freshwater lakes on Earth, combined outside of Lake Baikal in Russia. And while Donald Trump threatens annexation and trade wars, Mark Carney just weaponized the one resource America absolutely cannot replace, cannot import, and cannot survive without. The strategic nightmare Washington never saw coming. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you how Mark Carney's Thunder Bay announcement just redrew the map of North American power, why 40 million Americans are now dependent on Canadian permission for their drinking water, and what the collapse of America's $890 billion Great Lakes economy means for Trump's leverage over Canada forever. Let me tell you about the moment that changes everything. Thunder Bay, Ontario. The 15th of January, 2025. Mark Carney stands before Canadian media and signs the Great Lakes Protection Act into law. Not just policy adjustment, complete transformation of North American water politics. For generations, the Great Lakes operated under a gentleman's agreement. 5 massive interconnected lakes straddling the United States-Canada border with shared management and cooperative regulations. American states pulled water for cities, farms, and factories. Canadian provinces did the same. Nobody questioned whether unlimited extraction was sustainable because there was so much water that scarcity seemed impossible. That era just ended with Mark Carney's signature. The numbers that define this catastrophe for American interests are staggering. The Great Lakes Basin supports 40 million people who depend on lake water for drinking. $56 billion in annual agricultural production irrigated with Great Lakes water. $890 billion in total economic activity that relies on consistent water availability across manufacturing, shipping, energy production, tourism, fishing, and agriculture spanning 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces. All of it now operates knowing that Canada can shut off access if American policy threatens Canadian interests. Not immediately, not vindictively, but the legal authority exists, and Carney made unmistakably clear he is willing to use it. Here is what makes this strategic rather than just economic. Water isn't fungible. You cannot replace Great Lakes water with alternatives. You cannot import it from other regions at reasonable cost. You cannot synthesize it in laboratories. If access gets cut off, industries collapse, cities face crisis, agriculture fails completely. The United States has zero ability to secure water access through force, because Canada controls critical choke points where lake water flows between basins. The St. Lawrence Seaway runs entirely through Canadian territory before reaching the Atlantic. Niagara Falls sits on the border with Canadian control over flow rates. Lake Superior's outflows pass through Canadian jurisdiction. If Canada restricted flow or diverted water away from American access points, there is no military solution. You cannot invade an ally over water access. You cannot bomb infrastructure that supplies your own cities. You cannot threaten nuclear war over lake levels. Trump thought agricultural tariffs gave him leverage over Canada. Carney just demonstrated that Canada controls something far more valuable than wheat and canola. Canada controls the water that feeds American cities and farms, and unlike food exports, water cannot be replaced, imported, or substituted with alternatives. Every major American city on the Great Lakes now operates knowing their water supply flows through Canadian territory. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Buffalo. Millions of people depending on water that Canada has explicit legal authority to control under the Protection Act. American agriculture across 8 states irrigates crops, using water that originates in or flows through Canadian jurisdiction. Without Great Lakes access, Midwest farming faces the same catastrophic shortages hitting the American Southwest. American manufacturing that depends on lake water cannot relocate operations. Steel mills in Indiana and Ohio, automotive plants throughout Michigan, chemical facilities along Lake Erie, food processing across the basin, all built around water access that Canada now controls absolutely. The proposals to pipeline Great Lakes water to the Southwest weren't science fiction. Engineering firms developed detailed plans to save Arizona, Nevada, and California from water collapse. Political coalitions formed supporting massive infrastructure projects. Economic analyses showed the investments would pay off by preventing regional economic devastation. Arizona wanted water for Phoenix and Tucson facing immediate crisis. Nevada needed supply for Las Vegas with aquifers depleting rapidly. California sought to refill collapsing groundwater systems. Colorado hoped to stabilize the drying Colorado River. New Mexico faced agricultural devastation without new water sources. The plans all assumed Great Lakes water was available. Maybe expensive to transport, maybe politically difficult to approve, but ultimately available because the water existed and Americans facing shortage should access American resources. Except the Great Lakes aren't just American territory, they're shared with Canada, and Canada was watching its own water security deteriorate while Americans planned to drain shared resources for unilateral benefit. The Great Lakes Protection Act killed every proposal instantly. Canadian law now prohibits removing water from the basin in any form. It doesn't matter what American states need. It doesn't matter how much they're willing to pay. It doesn't matter what engineering solutions exist. The water isn't leaving Canadian jurisdiction under any circumstances. Western state governors reacted with fury. They accused Canada of hoarding resources during a crisis. They demanded emergency negotiations. They pressured Washington to force Canadian cooperation through economic threats. Carney's response was devastating. Canada faces its own water security challenges. Canadian communities have priority over Canadian resources. American water policy failures aren't Canada's responsibility to solve. The political message resonated perfectly with Canadian voters. Communities along the Great Lakes had watched private companies like Nestle bottle millions of liters for export, while local water quality deteriorated. They'd seen American states plan massive extraction projects while Canadian infrastructure remained underfunded. The export ban gave them control over resources they'd always assumed were protected, but legally weren't. Climate change created the vulnerability that Carney exploited brilliantly. Starting around 2010, lake levels started dropping dramatically. Superior fell to near record lows. Michigan, Huron hit levels not seen in decades. Erie and Ontario showed concerning declines as climate change accelerated evaporation while reducing precipitation. Warmer temperatures meant less ice cover in winter, increasing evaporation rates. Rainfall patterns shifted, delivering less water to feed the lakes. The balance that sustained the system for thousands of years was breaking, and American states facing their own water crises started looking north for solutions. The Colorado River was drying up completely. California aquifers were being depleted faster than natural recharge rates. Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico faced catastrophic shortages that threatened regional collapse. Politicians started asking why water-rich regions couldn't share with water-poor ones. Why should the Great Lakes hold trillions of gallons while the Southwest collapsed? That argument assumed the Great Lakes were American resources available for American use. The Protection Act shattered that assumption permanently. Canadian water stays in Canadian territory unless Canada explicitly agrees otherwise, and Carney made clear that American pressure tactics make Canadian cooperation less likely, not more. The leverage reversal is complete and devastating for Trump's strategy. Every tariff on Canadian goods now risks retaliation against American water access. Every threat to Canadian trade invites tightening of resource controls. Every escalation makes Canada more willing to prioritize Canadian interests over American demands. American cities need Canadian water to function. American agriculture needs Canadian water to survive. American industry needs Canadian water to operate. There are no alternatives, no substitutes, no way to eliminate dependence. Short of abandoning the entire Great Lakes region that generates nearly $1 trillion in annual economic activity. Carney didn't invent this leverage. It always existed, but previous Canadian governments avoided using it because doing so would damage relationships and escalate conflicts unnecessarily. Trump's annexation threats changed that calculation completely. If relationships are already damaged and conflicts already escalated, why not use the leverage that actually works? The result is that Trump faces an opponent he cannot pressure economically without triggering responses that hurt American interests more than Canadian ones. Canada isn't threatening to drain the lakes or divert water away from American cities, but the legal authority exists, and American industries now face the reality that their operations depend on continued Canadian cooperation. This represents leverage that cannot be countered by tariffs, trade restrictions, or military threats. Water is too essential, too irreplaceable, and too geographically concentrated in Canadian jurisdiction. If Trump escalates trade wars, Canada can respond by tightening environmental regulations that reduce water available for American industrial use. If American states push for extraction projects, Canada can unilaterally reject them, regardless of American political pressure. If Washington threatens Canadian sovereignty, Carney can point to the Great Lakes and remind Trump that millions of Americans depend on water flowing through Canadian territory on Canadian terms. Climate change is making water scarcity the defining resource challenge of the 21st century. The American Southwest is experiencing civilizational collapse. The Colorado River doesn't reach the ocean anymore. Aquifers that took millennia to fill are being drained in decades. Cities built in deserts are running out of water completely. The Great Lakes represent the largest remaining freshwater reserve in North America. Every state facing water crisis is looking at those lakes and wondering how to gain access. Political pressure to override Canadian authority will intensify as American shortages worsen and regional economies face collapse. But Canada just demonstrated it won't yield to American pressure. The export ban has overwhelming domestic support across every province touching the Great Lakes. Federal commitment is absolute, and the legal framework is now explicit and comprehensive. Water stays in Canada unless Canada agrees otherwise, and American threats make agreements less likely. American states can negotiate respectfully. They can offer partnerships, infrastructure investments, and shared environmental protections. What they cannot do is demand access or threaten consequences if Canada refuses. That fundamentally changes North American water politics after generations of American assumptions about resource availability. For decades, water was treated as abundant and accessible. Scarcity was a problem for other regions facing different geographic challenges. The Great Lakes meant security, reliability, and unlimited growth potential. Now, the Great Lakes are leverage in Canadian hands, and Carney showed he is willing to use that leverage when American pressure threatens Canadian interests. Trump threatened Canadian trade, assuming agriculture was Canada's critical vulnerability. He imposed tariffs, expecting Canadian farmers to pressure Ottawa for concessions. He suggested economic annexation, expecting Canada to have no alternatives to American markets. The Great Lakes export ban revealed his fundamental miscalculation. Canada isn't economically dependent on the United States in ways that create one-sided vulnerability. Canada controls resources the United States absolutely requires for survival, and when Trump escalated pressure, he gave Canada political cover to weaponize those resources without appearing aggressive or unreasonable. This is the strategic nightmare American policymakers feared, but never expected to confront. An ally that controls critical resources becoming willing to use them as leverage because American pressure made cooperation seem more dangerous than confrontation. Trump wanted to prove American dominance over neighboring countries. Instead, he revealed American dependence on resources controlled by neighbors. Every city, farm, and factory along the Great Lakes now understands their water flows through Canadian territory on Canadian terms. The $890 billion Great Lakes corridor isn't locked shut yet, but Canada installed the locks, handed the keys to Mark Carney, and made clear that access depends on respect for Canadian sovereignty. Trump has zero cards left to play. He cannot threaten the country that controls America's water supply. He cannot pressure the leader who just proved that American cities depend on Canadian permission to function, and there is nothing Trump can do except watch the water flow and hope Canada chooses to keep cooperating. The gentleman's agreement era is over. The Great Lakes Protection Act begins the era of Canadian water sovereignty, and Mark Carney just destroyed America's $890 billion Lifeline forever.